Let's not forget there will always be racism in the world, and there will always be patriarchy in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So black women will always need black women to help lift them up, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. We need each other. We will always, unfortunately, be getting the short end of the stick.
Welcome to the Zami Nobla National Organization of Black Lesbians on Aging podcast. We are your sound source for Black lesbian herstory. I'm your host, Angela Denise Davis. It's 2020 and this is our first podcast episode of the year. I hope your vision is clear and you are moving into a space of thriving in your sphere of influence. Well, today we're going to talk with someone who is doing just that. In August of 2019, I interviewed Sheila Alexander-Reid, who lives in D.C., the District of Columbia, and is the director of the Mayor's Office of LGBT Affairs. In addition, she's the founder of Women in the Life. We'll talk to her about the history of Women in the Life and how it has emerged into a social justice association. Disclaimer, this is a long one, so grab your favorite beverage, a comfy throw, and sit back and listen to our conversation with Sheila Alexander-Reid.
My name is Sheila Alexander-Reid, and I believe I move in the world as a passionate advocate for gender, race, and LGBTQ equality and equity.
Wonderful. Well, we are here in your home in D.C. and very grateful
welcome.
that you invited us into your living space and excited to have you on the Zami Nobla podcast. I'm excited for a couple of reasons, just because you're a fascinating Black lesbian that we need to know and the work that you've done, and also because the work that you've done that is so exciting to me and takes me back is your work with Women in the Life, the publication, and how that has been a real resource for our community. So why don't we start with you first telling us a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, and then we'll segue into your talking about how you came up with the idea of your Women in the Life publication and the event surrounding that.
Sure. Well, a little bit about myself. I grew up the first 11 years of my life in Cincinnati, Ohio. And I'm the oldest of 3 girls and the second of 4 children. I have 1 brother and 2 sisters. In Cincinnati, we lived in a all-black neighborhood. My father, who was a rare black Republican, got a job with Richard Nixon. And we moved to D.C., or Bethesda, Maryland, I should say, which was an all-white neighborhood. I had to quickly adapt, and I had to see that I am, that the world is not all black people, and that the world is not all white people, and that you will be judged on just who you appear to be, not even who you are. And so, just to sum it up, the 4 Reid children were the only black children in the school when we were in Bethesda, a little Catholic school. And when I went to high school, I was the only black girl in my class. So I was always, what I call myself is like the white person whisperer. I was non-threatening, I was fun, funny, savvy, if you will. And so I was able to mix and mingle in any crowd. However, I felt something missing, and so I wanted to immerse myself in an all-black environment, so I chose to go to Spelman College. And that's where I got my sense of self as a black woman. And I dare say, and started feeling a little bit about being different as it relates to sexual orientation. I was surrounded by beautiful black men from Morehouse and Clark and Atlanta University and Morris Brown. And I was surrounded by beautiful black women at Spelman and all these other schools as well. But I really never got into any deep relationship because I wasn't really attracted to men, but I didn't realize that I was attracted to women. Mm-hmm. So I like to say I went to all-girls school, didn't realize I was a lesbian in high school. Then I went to all-girls college and didn't realize I was a lesbian. And it was only when I was 26 years old that I came to realization that I was attracted to women. And so there was 8 years that I could have been sort of sowing my wild oats. But when I came out at 26, I had to make up for lost time.
Okay.
So that's how I realized going to the clubs was less than fulfilling. Mm-hmm. So I started my own events, mm-hmm. Women in Life. And ultimately, that led to starting a magazine, and that led to having other events, and that led to a whole slew of other things because I was really just trying to fill a need that I had. Mm-hmm. Being a black lesbian was more than just partying. So I needed to make sure that we were also sort of disseminating information and educating ourselves about our health and about culture and where we stood in it, and about bias and prejudice. And at the same time, I was working at Washington City Paper, which is very similar to Creative Loafing in Atlanta. At one point, it was owned by Creative Loafing. So it was an alternative weekly. Again, I was the only black person there. Again, the white person whisperer. I was doing a lot of unconscious bias work, unbeknownst to me. I didn't even know the term at the time. But I was always the one that they would come to and say, Sheila, we're about to write this story about, let's say, Marion Barry. Do you think it's offensive, or do you think it's racist? And I had to give them my honest opinion. I will also say that growing up in Bethesda, there was a certain amount of instability in my home life. My parents argued quite a bit when we moved to Bethesda from Ohio. And so that is where I learned the need to advocate for women. Mm. My mother is not a shrinking violet, but I will say she suffered some abuse from my father because he was a much bigger person, and then when they went at it, she was always on the losing end. Many times when they were arguing, my brother and I had to pull them apart. So that is where I really learned that women often get the short end of the stick, mm-hmm. and that there needs to be a certain level of advocacy on their behalf, sometimes when they can't even advocate for themselves. So that's where I learned a lot of the core principles who I am. I'm okay in a black setting, I'm okay in a white setting, but I'm always going to be looking for some sort of equity, and I'm always going to be advocating for the underdog.
So let's go back a bit. So when you came out at 26, what was that aha moment for you?
Well, I was driving to work one morning, and I was driving past a woman at a bus stop. And sometimes if you look at a woman and she may smile, look at you or whatever, and look away, women are interesting, particularly if they don't know why you're looking at them. They may, roll their eyes like, what are you looking at? And why are you looking at me? So I was looking at this woman, and she was really attractive, but she was looking down. So I thought it was safe to kind of just stare as I was waiting at the light. But all of a sudden, she looked back up and looked me dead in the eye, and we held this like gaze, and I got goosebumps on my arms. I was like, oh my gosh, what was that? She didn't smile, she didn't frown, she looked just right back at me, and it was the most jarring but exciting moment of my life. And as I got to the next light, I said, Sheila, that's why you're not attracted to men. You're attracted to women. And that was my aha moment. Mm-hmm. Just that woman looking me dead in the eye. I wish I knew where she was today. I would thank her. I would thank her.
Well, that's such a poignant story, because sometimes people think there are these torrid moments in our lives that tell us who we are in terms of our sexual identity, but that's such a well put reflection on how that happens for so many of us.
Just one day, I just happened to look at somebody who looked back at me and felt this connection that I had never felt before.
Going further back still, because I am a graduate of Clark Atlanta University, and I remember what it was like being in that space and recognizing that it was a very homophobic environment, the AU Center, period, certainly when I was there.
It was.
How was it like being at Spelman, even though you did not know you were a lesbian, but just sensing that, or maybe you didn't?
I didn't even sense it. I was totally disengaged from my feelings for anybody. Mm-hmm. I just knew that I would date men, and then they would want more than I was willing to give them, and I didn't realize why. But there were some out lesbians on Spelman's campus, and there were some women that we suspected were lesbians, and a lot of them stayed around the same dorm. Mm-hmm. And I remember on the way to Sisters Chapel, we passed that dorm, and we was kind of walk slow and try to see if we could catch, some sign of lesbianism. Maybe they've somebody walking or holding hands. And it wasn't as if we were looking, trying to spot it to support them. We were looking at it so that we could gossip and make fun of them. Mm-hmm. So there was a level of homophobia that I was engaged in that I am now clearly ashamed of and apologetic about. And there may have been something in me that made me curious. Unbeknownst to my friends who were there to gawk, I might have been there, just to try to see what do lesbians do, but was not aware of my intentions. So it's interesting. I will say that now that I think back, I really think in the 70s, late 70s and early 80s, that anybody who could be out in that homophobic time period, that homophobic sort of living arrangement, had to be a badass woman. Mm-hmm. You have to be a badass woman who had a strong sense of self. Mm-hmm. And many of these women were. And so now I look back and I'm like, look at that. They didn't care. And how strong they must be, and how assured they must be to have been like that back in the day. I'm just getting to be like that now, some 39 years later. Yeah. So I'm really, I think about that quite a bit. And now Spelman has Aphrodite, a lesbian or queer women organization to support them on the campus, and I think that's awesome. And I wish that was there. If that had been there, I might have come out. I might have, realized that I was a lesbian a lot earlier. But in the meantime, when I did come out, I had to kick the door in, not just open the door. I kicked the door in and came all the way out, and I've been out ever since. And so now there's not a closet big enough to hold me.
Well, you talked about the impetus to create events in the publication Woman in the Life was because you really wanted something that fulfilled your need for community and being able to see yourself reflected in the world. Tell us a little bit more about the beginning of Women in the Life and what that was like initially in late
1993. Well, the parties started in 1993. And the magazine started in late 1993. But I really think it took off in 1994. So that's why we're celebrating the 25th anniversary this year in 2019. But really, when I came out with 2 or 3 friends who were already in a relationship. And I asked them to take me around to see what the lesbian world was like. I was attracted to a coworker, but she was a white woman and didn't really socialize in the lesbian world. So I really wanted to, I was all in the minute I realized that I was out. Mm-hmm. The minute I came out, I was all in. And so my friends took me to these clubs. There was the Fays, there was Hill Haven, and there was the Hung Jury. And there were a host of gay male clubs as well. And several clubs were men and women mixed together. And I think that over time, the men and women mixed less and less. And there were lesbian clubs and there were gay clubs, and never the two shall meet. But back in the day, there were clubs like The Edge and Encore, and even tracks where men and women partied together. So when I went out to these lesbian clubs, I was underwhelmed. First of all, I was excited to see so many black women who were also gay, but I had just really was looking for somebody to be in a relationship with. And a lot of these women, I just didn't get the sense that they were as serious as I was about my life and about sort of changing the world. A lot of people, these people were in their 20s. I was in my late 20s. They were in their early 20s. And so I really, even then, had a lot of passion for helping marginalized people and also sort of changing the world for the better. And when I realized that most people in the club were not on that same mindset, I decided that I wanted to have a party and have some friends, and then have them invite their friends, so to create another sort of more intentional group of women who were like-minded, who were professional and educated and interested in making a difference in the world. And you didn't have to be all three. You just needed to be one of those three categories, in my opinion, right? So that's what I did. I invited my friends, and then they invited their friends. And actually, I didn't start off with Women in Life. The first group that I was in was called VTR. It was three friends. It was Chris Vera, Lisa Thornhill, and Sheila Reid. So that stood for VTR Productions. And because I worked at Washington City Paper, I had access to graphic artists, so I was always the marketing person. And Chris was the sort of the admin person, and Lisa was the talent recruiter. But what I found was that because got that type A personality, I tended to want to do a lot of the work. And so I did a lot of the work and eventually got burnt out. And so I decided to take a break. And when I took a break, I went to New York with some friends and went to a lesbian party hosted by a group called Women in the Life. And these women were awesome and beautiful and diverse and just sort of interesting in all ways. And about a year or so later, I found out that they had disbanded, if you will, as a group holding these events. And so I asked them if they minded if I used their name, because I liked Women in Life because it says a lot without saying a lot. And they said sure. And so that's when I came back with my own organization and founded it as an LLC. And that ran for, I'm going to say 6 to 8 months before I realized that a magazine would be really important. Actually, I started off as a newsletter. I saw a story about breast cancer, how black women are much more less likely to get breast cancer, but we're much more likely to die from breast cancer. And I thought that was interesting, right? And I said, well, why is that? And it's because we're less likely to go to a doctor until it's almost stage 4, because we're so busy taking care of everybody else. We're not really focused on ourselves. And that really hit me, and I made a copy of that article. I think it was in Elle magazine at the time. And so I brought that, and then I found another article, and maybe 4 articles were on an 8.5 by 11. I just cut and paste, and I handed them out at a party that I had in Blue Penguin on Pennsylvania Avenue on Capitol Hill. And halfway through the party, all of them were gone. I printed about 100.
Wow.
And halfway through the party, I went back to the front door, and they were all gone. And so I went down the street to Kinko's, which has open 24 hours a day. This is probably like 1 o'clock in the morning, and printed another 100 copies and came back and put them at the front door. And then at 2 o'clock, when the party was ending, they were all gone. So I was like, wow, these women really wanted this information. So that is what made me decide, okay, you know what, maybe we should do a 4-page the next time. And so that's what happened. The next month we did a 4-pager, and I had a friend who was a sports enthusiast. I said, look, why don't you be my sports columnist? And I had a friend who was a really great creative writer, and I said, why don't you just be a columnist and you can write about whatever you want each month. And so that's kind of how the magazine came to be. And the next one was just a 4-page front and back inside newsletter. And over time, it became 24 to I think it's as many as 42 pages,
Wow.
saddle stitched, glossy cover. So it just grew and grew.
Yeah.
And one of the things that was really important about it was we had a community calendar in the center most of the time. And Sister Space and Books was open at the time on 15th and U Street. And they would always have this great authors and speakers come. And we also had Blues Alley, which had these great artists come. And there were, GW's, Lisner Auditorium, would have Nina Simone come. So I was like, we have to have a calendar that tells people sort of things to do of interest. And that really sort of helped people to understand that this was really a community resource. Because you could read all those other articles anywhere else, but this was Black lesbians had put together this calendar of things that would be of interest to other Black lesbians, and you could not find that anywhere else. So that is kind of how we sort of created a need for people to pick it up, if you will. Because there was already a Washington Blade here in D.C. as a newspaper, and there was another paper that was starting, an entertainment paper called Metro Weekly. But both of those were from a gay male perspective. And you could very rarely find any women's perspective in those magazines at the time. And even rarer was the Black lesbian perspective. So that's how the magazine got started. And
how did you finance it?
That's a great question. A lot of it was out of my pocket. I never got paid for those sorts of things. We did have advertisers. Because I sold advertising for a living at the Washington City paper, I knew how to sell advertising, but you didn't want to have a conflict of interest. So I really wasn't going to be selling ads to anybody who would be interested in being in the city paper. A lot of the time, the Black gay male papers were financed by a lot of the pharmaceutical companies, because HIV, was I wouldn't say at its peak, but it was peaking. And when I went to those same pharmaceuticals to see if they would advertise in Women in Life, many times they would say no, because they didn't think that women were at risk, because of course they were wrong. So the advertisers we had were maybe restaurants, or maybe the 2 or 3 clubs, or maybe somebody selling jewelry, or some lesbian-owned businesses that wanted to promote themselves. So it was a lot more sort of lower-level advertisers, which required a lot more work, because you had to get 20 or 30 of those versus 2 or 3 of those big pharmaceutical 4-page ads. And as somebody who was sort of curating the stories, publishing them, doing the layout and selling the ads and distributing it, I was running ragged. And after I think 10 years, even though I had a very core group of friends that helped me, those same writers helped me distribute the magazine and publish it, but we were all tired. And so after 10 years, and keep in mind, at the same time we were doing this magazine, we had our full-time jobs, and we were doing a party at least once a month, and maybe twice a month if there was a holiday in that month. So it was a lot. And we loved it, but then at the end of the day, we're like, you know what? I think we need a break. And so we stopped doing the magazine. The other thing is that the internet was coming out. So this is before social media, before the internet. And so once the internet came up, you can just go online and see what's going on at these different places as far as a community calendar. Now, that wasn't curated specifically from a Black lesbian perspective, but you could go and see Sister Space and Books calendar online, or these different musical venues, and decide for yourself where you wanted to go. So there was less and less of a need for that sort of thing. So that was another reason. And also, as we got older, younger women were coming out to the parties, and they had a lot of anger issues. And so while we never had any fights or anything, I noticed there were a lot of parties we had to break up fights. I'm like, what's going on here? And Women in Life started in D.C., and then we were invited to the Black Pride in Philadelphia, and then we were just invited to New York's Black Pride, and then we went to Baltimore, and ultimately Atlanta. So we had gone up and down the East Coast with these parties, and taking the magazine with us, and holding down full-time jobs. So it was a lot. And I didn't even realize how much it was at the time. But when I think about it now, it's like, wow, how did you do all that? But at the time, we just did it because we loved it. And we met so many different women between the people that we wrote about, the people that picked up the magazine, the people that would tell us how a story impacted them. It was just a lovely, great time to be a black lesbian. And then what we found out as time went on and we stopped doing parties and stopped doing the magazine, there are other younger generations came out doing parties. They didn't, and maybe even a couple of magazines actually. And what we found is as time went on, there was less and less of us at these parties and more young people at the parties. And then now, if you fast forward 25 years, the word lesbian is very rarely even used out in the community. Queer is used a lot, and I think a lot of black lesbians feel a sense of erasure going on. Mm-hmm. And so I've had a lot of conversations about that and a lot of conversations with young people. My job working for the mayor's office, I serve all of the community, not just the lesbians or gays, transgender, everybody. And so there's that has given me a lot of access.
And what's your role at the mayor's office?
I'm director of the mayor's office of LGBTQ Affairs.
Okay.
So my job is to be a liaison to the community for the mayor. Mm-hmm. So I let her know what the needs are of the community, and I let the community know what the mayor's vision is for them. And so in doing that, I've talked to a lot of queer women and asked them why they choose to use the word queer versus lesbian. I said, well, you're attracted to women, right? And they're like, yeah. I said, well, doesn't that make you a lesbian? They're like, no, because I may be attracted to a man. I said, okay, so doesn't that make you bisexual? And they would say, no, that you're locked into the binary of just men and women. I may be attracted to a transgender man or a transgender woman or a non-conforming person or a gender non-conforming. They had all these different words. Or maybe attracted to a pansexual person or an asexual person or an intersex person. And so queer is a great term. It's an umbrella term. So it just means, I am what I am. I was like, I never thought about it like that. Mm-hmm. But that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So that's helped me sort of to explain to other lesbians why there should be room at the table for everybody.
And that was my next question, is how do we begin to have conversations with older black lesbians who are very hesitant to some of these new names and new ways that younger, in quotes, black lesbian or black queer women find themselves in? How do we begin some conversations that can foster intergenerational work? I know we do a lot of that with Zammy Noble, but I'm just curious in terms of particularly where you are here in DC and what you've seen. How can we best have those conversations, particularly around names? Because I know a lot of older black lesbians don't like the word queer.
Right. So, and most people over 40 don't like the word queer because it was a slur. I mean, when you were called queer, you may have been called dyke. If you were male, you may have been called faggot. So all of those terms are negative. And so to just say on a dime, it's now positive, go ahead and embrace it, is a tough thing. That's a tough ask, right? So I often sit down and get both sides to sit down and say, look, I would like you to talk about your life and your story, and then I would like this other part, probably the queer women, to talk about their life, their stories. And what you will find is, when it comes to relationships, there are a lot of similarities. When it comes to dealing with society, there are a lot of similarities. When it comes to dealing with family, there's a lot of similarities. So what we end up finding out when we have these discussions that are a safe space, there are more similarities than differences. And what many of the queer women will say is, it's not that I am condemning you for being a lesbian. I just don't think that label fits me. I'm not saying that lesbians don't exist. I'm not saying that you shouldn't be a lesbian. I'm just saying that I prefer queer. And I think a lot of lesbians are offended that these young women don't want to call themselves lesbians. And so I believe that there's a certain amount of power to say we've taken this negative word queer, and my partner calls herself a dyke. She's 10 years younger than me. She's an out dyke. She's like, no, I'm not a lesbian, I'm a dyke. Yeah, I'm a dyke. So, I mean, that's another term that was a slur. So these women have taken the term, women and or non-binary people, taken the term and changed it and made it a positive. And so the fact that I had a negative connotation for it 10 to 20 years ago, I have to allow them this space to identify however they want to identify. And why should that be a threat to me? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I guarantee you, and I've noticed even the next generation is reclaiming the L word. Mm-hmm. I know some very young 18, 19, 20-year-olds who refuse to be queer. They want to be lesbians because as an homage to the lesbian, they're skipping over the queer generation. So I just think it's cyclical. Just as we fought so hard to be out and to be accepted, who are we now to not accept this next generation, whatever they want to call themselves? And of course, we want the lesbian legacy to continue, but we have to. It may continue in another way, shape, or form. And I as I see younger women who want to be called lesbians, it does my heart good.
Yes.
But in any event, before lesbians, we were all gay. So, I mean, these terms evolve, and we have to understand that it's not going to end with us.
Well, and I think so many of us also recognize gay as being a very limited word because it's oftentimes identified as a male, and women aren't seen within the framework.
So that's when we broke off.
Yes. To me, I think it's exciting because I think the more, in particular, older Black lesbians show up and tell our stories and declare who we are, the more those younger lesbians that you're talking about, 18, 19-year-olds who are claiming that term, can hear that.
Yes.
I think it's a lifeline.
They wanna call themselves what Audre Lorde called herself.
Exactly.
Audre Lorde didn't call herself a queer woman. Audre Lorde was an out, proud black lesbian. So there's a certain level of pride with that term.
Yes.
And I think that's what's going to come through ultimately.
Yes.
And if it takes a while, so be it. In the meantime, we tell our stories. We make sure people know that we are here and that we were here and that we have done our part to contribute to what comes next, regardless of what they call themselves.
This is a perfect segue into older Black women, some of them who would have fit those categories you talked about in terms of being professional and committed, educated, who are now 60s, 70s, 80s, and don't say I'm a Black lesbian, are afraid of saying I'm a Black lesbian, feel threatened by saying I'm a Black lesbian, and don't find themselves in community or either find themselves out in the world in a glass house. In a glass closet, so to speak.
Yes, that makes me sad.
How do we address and help those women be able to tell their stories and speak loud and proud about being who they are?
Well, I think that is a justification for keeping Zami Nobler around and Women in Life around and the different organizations that are around the country around. Because we have to create community for ourselves. And even though we may not be clubbing, that doesn't mean that we don't need to exist anymore. At the time, it wasn't about the clubbing, it was about providing a social outlet. We were closeted, we were targeted, we had to provide our own safe spaces. And so now, some would argue that those safe spaces are just as necessary now, given our current sort of presidential administration. But even if you say that the safe spaces are not as needed, I dare say that if you go to those people who are being targeted when they try to go to an assisted living facility and therefore they go back in the closet, I think that's what these organizations need to lift up their voices on behalf of these people so that we cannot be erased, and so we do not have to go back in the closet. And I think that that's where sort of working for a mayor comes in handy, right? I will make sure that we have policies where senior living facilities are LGBTQ culturally competent. Meaning, if you're getting some government funding, perhaps you need to have this training, and perhaps you need to have make sure your policies are diverse and inclusive. And even if it's private and it's not taking government funding, there are certain laws that prevent discrimination in the District of Columbia. And many other jurisdictions as well. But in D.C., housing is covered under discrimination. And so you should not be discriminated against now. However, we know that discrimination occurs. But what we need to do is empower the people who feel that they are being discriminated against to reach out and contact either my office, Mayor's Office of LGBTQ Affairs, or the Office of Human Rights, who will quickly put into place an investigation and mediate and either get you some funding or some payment as restitution, and sort of force that institution to change their policies. Now, is it going to be rocky? Is that going to happen overnight? No, but we have to fight for it. We have to, because what's the alternative? I'm not going back in the closet, and I can't count on kids to take care of me. I don't have any kids. So I have 2 nieces, bless their hearts, but I don't want to be a burden to them. And so I think it is incumbent upon all of us to do our part now and lift up our voices collectively on behalf of those who will not or cannot, because we have to make sure that people know that we are seen, and that just as we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of Stonewall, 50 years later we should not still have to have these conversations about going back in the closet in order to survive.
I want to get back to talking about women in the life, but before I do that, because of your role with the mayor's office and the work you've just done in community here in D.C. over the past years, decades even, what has the Black LGBT community, and we can talk about that broadly, or we can talk about that specifically, the Black lesbian community here in D.C., how has it changed over the time when you first started Women in the Life and with the parties and now?
Well, the Black LGBTQ community has also sort of undergone a level of gentrification, if you will. So the reason why Black prides were necessary was because we were usually not invited or not welcome or not feeling welcome at Capitol Pride or whatever the other pride was called. So we had to create our own safe spaces. So I will dare say now, Capitol Pride, this is just an example in DC, is now a lot more open and affirming and diverse, if you will. There's still some problematic issues, but they're working on them. So people think, well, do we still need a Black Pride? And I say yes, but that's just my opinion, because nowhere else are you going to be affirmed, nowhere else are you going to be lifted up as a people, unless you're with your people. And I think that is what's changed in the Black community, whereas it was us against the world, where we were all sort of one tightly knit group. Now it seems a little more loosey-goosey. A lot of organizations are not as, well, how would you say, they're a lot more diverse, which is good in some ways and bad in others, right? So there's no really sense of going to a Black LGBTQ club. I think the last one, which was the Mill, the Bachelor's Mill, just closed a couple of months ago. So Women in Life is come back as a result of the Trump administration taking office as a social justice organization, but we're not back as a party organization. You know, we're back, we will socialize to create the safe space and lift each other up and to raise money to create change. So even our purpose is different. So it's a lot of things have changed. There's a lot of evolving, and some say that it's for the good and some say that it's to our detriment. I just say that let's not forget there will always be racism in the world, and there will always be patriarchy in the world. So Black women will always, not always, hopefully there'll be a change ultimately, but I don't see it happening anytime soon. So Black women will always need Black women to help lift them up, in my opinion. We need each other. We will always, unfortunately, be getting the short end of the stick. Like I said, I started my advocacy the minute I saw my mother was getting the short end of the stick. My mother's a brilliantly educated woman. She started the sickle cell disease program at NIH. She was the only black female pediatrician in Cincinnati when she started her practice. So she's no shrinking violet. But even that, was not enough for her to have a voice at the table. So when I say I think we will always be suffering from the intersectional discrimination, we should always be around to lift each other up. Until those things go away, we're going to be needed here. People my age don't go out. And when I go to a club or even a bar, it's usually some young people out, and I can't really get into it because that's not my thing. I don't drink anyway, so I probably wouldn't be at a bar too much anyway. But if I was to go for a reason to socialize, I don't really see my people there, people my age, and that I can relate to. So where are we? And then how do we find community outside of that sort of place where we were where we were 20, 30, 40 years ago? I think we have to find new places to show up and new ways to show up and new ways to find community, because as you can see, we're still going to be sort of, as I keep saying, getting the short end of the stick.
So when did Women in the Life reinvent itself as a social justice organization?
Let me go back. So Women in Life LLC existed starting in 1993. Women in Life magazine was printed by Women in Life LLC. And then after, I believe 2006, Women in Life sort of became inactive, the LLC, and we started Women in Life Association, which is a nonprofit.
Okay.
And so that happened because my mentor and good friend Wanda Alston, who said, Sheila, you're doing a great job with the magazine and with the parties, but you've got all these women that are looking up to you and you need to do more. And I said, well, I got a full-time job. I am publishing and editing and distributing a magazine, and I'm throwing 2 or 3 events, because in addition to the parties every week we had an open mic poetry. Every Wednesday.
Wow.
Yes.
Wow.
Every week. And you wanted me to do more. And one day I got a phone call just out of the blue that Wanda had been killed by her next door neighbor. Wanda had the job at the time she had the job that I have now. She was the director of the mayor's office of LGBT Affairs. And so she was like the head gay in DC.
Oh my gosh.
And when she was killed, it devastated our community. She was killed by her next door neighbor. We didn't know who had killed her at the time. We just knew that she had been found dead in her house. And her partner, Stacy Long, now Stacy Long Simmons, found her. And Wanda's family came in and basically would not let Stacy be a part of any of the funeral planning. Stacy barely was able to get her things out of Wanda's house. They were together for a number of years planning a family, and they had gone home to visit Wanda's family, but that didn't matter. The minute Wanda was gone, they came in and pushed Stacy out, and we watched that.
And what year was this?
I'm going to say maybe 2008. And so that was heartbreaking. And to make matters worse, when we went to honor her with this sort of state-like funeral, the mayor, every council member, everybody who was anybody was there. Her family, Wanda's family, said if you use the word lesbian in the program guide or in the program, there will be no funeral. We will take her body back to, I think, Norfolk, someplace.
But wasn't that Virginia. A part of her title?
That was her title. And they said, unless you put her back in the closet, there will be no funeral.
Wow.
So there was this huge community outrage. And I was part of the side that said, then take her back. Take her back to Norfolk. We can do a tribute. We can do a memorial without the body. Wanda would be turning over in her grave if she knew that you all were trying to put her back in the closet. Wanda was about 5'3", 110 pounds, soaking wet, feisty as hell. So, Women Life Association started because when Wanda died, there was a big split in the community, and we had to come together after the split, and we came together and talked about, sort of healing. And one of the things I said was, somebody needs to start something to protect people so they have a will, so when they die, this can't happen. The family can't come in and suddenly put somebody back in the closet and push their partner out. And then that person who I was talking to, who happened to be Donna Payne from the Human Rights Campaign, said, well, Sheila, why don't you start it? Why don't you start a nonprofit and have a program? And so I always say, be careful what you ask for, because then somebody's going to say, well, go ahead and do it. So I said, you're right. I'm going to go ahead and do it. And I said, and Wanda wanted me to do more anyway. Every time I talk to her, why aren't you doing more than just these parties and these open mics and this magazine? I said, more? Oh my gosh. So I started Women Life Association, and the first program was called the Wanda's Will Project. We had attorneys come in pro bono and did these huge legal workshops about the importance of having a will. Wow. Because there was no marriage equality, there was no civil unions, there was no domestic partnership, and so you had no protection. And the audience was LGBTQ, Black, White, Asian, Pacific Islander, Two-Spirit, Latinx, everybody. It wasn't just Black women. It wasn't just women in the life. Women Life Association programs helped everybody. And I'm really proud of that. And once we went ahead and got marriage equality, well, it was incremental. We had to get the civil unions and domestic partnerships. But once we got that, we decided that this program wasn't necessary anymore. So we kind of slowly became inactive. But then, just a couple of years ago, when we saw this white racist person elected president, and I went to Creating Change in Philadelphia because I didn't want to be here for the inauguration. I went to Creating Change in Philadelphia, which happened at the same time as the inauguration. Reverend William Barber was the keynote. And why did I went by myself, and I sat in the back of a huge auditorium, and he said something about, you need to stay in your sphere of influence. If you're going to make a difference, stay in your sphere of influence and make a difference there. Too many of us stretch ourselves to be all things to all people. Stay in your sphere of influence and make a difference. We are at a time where we all have to, pull up yourselves by your bootstraps and get yourself together and go out there and make a difference. And you need to find out where you're most influential and make a difference there. And I sat there and I said, you know what? And this is, several years after Women Life had been inactive. And I was quite comfortable with my job in the mayor's office. And I thought I was doing a lot, but I realized I really wasn't doing enough. And when I heard that speech, I got those goosebumps again. Just like when I saw that woman on 16th Street staring back at me, I got goosebumps. I was like, oh my God, I got to get back to my sphere of influence, which is women in the life. And so I went back and I reactivated it, and we've been organizing and try to figure out how best to protect ourselves, because we are under assault. And so that's where we are now. And so that's why I really appreciate this interview, because we are at this sort of nexus of figuring out how do we use the visibility and the brand of Women in Life to affect change. And if it takes throwing a party, so be it, to raise the money to do it. But that has to be a means to an end. It is not throwing a party for the sake of throwing a party. And so I am in the process of meeting with my board and some other queer women and some other lesbians to figure out how best to move forward. And so this is, you caught me at a really great time, because we have to really figure out how to do this, and we have to figure out how to do it really fast, because we don't have the luxury of time. And if it's about advocacy, and I'm sure it is it going to be advocacy for seniors, LGBT or Black lesbian seniors? Is it advocacy it should be advocacy for awareness about our issues and making people stand up for issues. But are we talking about getting officials who are already elected to know our issues and speak up about our issues? Are we talking about making sure that Black lesbians are elected officials? What are we talking about, and how best to do it? So I'm really in the process of surveying to come up with a really clear agenda, because I feel like this is a really key time, and this is sort of like the third or fourth iteration of Women in Life. It's the second iteration of the association, but if you go back to the parties, the open mic, then you got the magazine, then you got the nonprofit, now you got the nonprofit again. Each time we've evolved, and I believe that this is a time to evolve into something very meaningful. And I want to make sure that it is connected to social justice, and not just in name, but in action. So that's where we are today. And so I'm speaking to Zami Nobla to see what they're doing, because I think the future is connecting all these dots.
Yes.
We've been disparate dots across the country.
Yes.
And I think that this is, and we, this is before social media. And now that we have social media, I think there are ways that we can link up and be much more powerful together. So,
well, I'm just so grateful for this interview. I've heard about Women in the Life. I've heard about you. I know that Carrie Cotton Williams has also been instrumental in making Women in the Life archival, which I want to talk a bit about that, because Carrie used to live in Atlanta and was and still is a great friend of Zami Noble, and we just love her dearly. What has her connection been with Women in the Life?
So I'm glad you brought that up, because until a few months ago, I didn't know who she was or that she existed. I wrote a letter to some millennials who honored me as a lesbian elder. And first of all, I had to say, am I old enough to be an elder? So I was not appreciative at first, but I took my mother with me, and she says, like, Sheila, if you're an elder, I'm a super elder. I'm like, okay, good. I gotcha. So we went to this event together, and I had to write a letter to the millennials who were hosting the event as to the history of Women in Life and the legacy and what we were passing on to them. And it really made me go back. I reached out to Chris Smith, who started Affinity in Chicago around the same time as I was very active in the Women in Life before the association. And we talked, and I also talked to Francine Ramsey of Zuna Institute in Sacramento. And they were very helpful, reminding me of all the many things that we went through, having these sort of programs that weren't funded, that we had to sort of count on the community and ourselves to fund, and how we were always up against male organizations that were always funded by pharmaceuticals, and or they were funded by government agencies, and how we had to like make a way out of no way. And so I wrote this letter to that effect and gave it to these millennials. And then my partner, Aisha Shahida Simmons, to her credit, around February, I believe, said, Sheila, you should print that somewhere, because that's a great letter and it's a history. More people need to know that. And she was helpful in getting it printed on the Feminist Wire, which is an online publication. And when that letter hit the Feminist Wire, I also printed it, or put a link to it on Facebook, I believe, on my page and the Women Life page, and it went bananas. The whole sort of social media world went bananas. I remember those parties. I remember the open mic. I remember you did an event for HRC. I remember we had a Mystics game. And just everybody. And then I went into my basement and found a bunch of the magazines that were becoming mildewed. And I printed a couple of the magazine covers on social media, and that really just took a whole nother level. I remember that cover. I remember those magazines. I remember Sister Space and Books. When are we going to have a reunion? Where it's going on? How can I get a copy of that magazine? And I had no idea that people even cared. So this was just a few months ago, and I was like, wow. I mean, literally, the whole sort of social media of Women Life and of Sheila Alexander-Reid blew up. And so I said, well, I don't know how you can get the magazines. And somebody said, well, maybe you should digitize them. And so we talked to Humanities DC, which is an organization that funds, that gives out grants for people who want to tell the story about DC. And we asked them, could we apply to digitize the magazine? And they said yes. And then I was talking about it to somebody on my board, and she said, well, wait a minute, why don't you talk to DC Public Library? She said, I happen to know that they're digitizing the Washington Blade. We only had 96 issues. The Blade had, they come out every week. We were monthly. They had thousands of issues they had to digitize. And she said, and the person who they're working with is a black lesbian. Her name is Carrie Cotton Williams. You should reach out to her. And I said, what? So I called her, and she said, well, let's talk. And so, long story short, Carrie was instrumental in getting the DC Public Library to digitize the magazines. At the same time, I was contacted by American University, who wanted me to donate the magazines to them, and they would digitize them, and they would hold the originals, the collection. They were starting an LGBT collection. And I was torn, DC Public Library, American University, or my basement. Those were the choices. And then Beverly Guy Sheftoff from Spelman said, Sheila, you went to Spelman. Don't give those magazines to American University. You need to be having that in Atlanta. And so I went from nobody cares about these magazines to suddenly there was like almost a bidding war for the magazines. So I chose DC Public Library because I knew that it would have access. I don't know anybody who's going to go up on American University's campus in their lovely climate-controlled space, which was amazing, by the way, to look at these magazines. Now, they would digitize them just like the library is doing, but they want to also hold the originals. So I decided that I wasn't ready to part with the originals, but if DC Public Library would digitize them at no charge, and I don't have to go through a process of trying to apply for a grant and hoping I got a grant, I chose them over American University, and I thank American University profusely because all of that just showed me the need and the value.
Yes.
I had no idea that anybody cared about these magazines 25 years later. And so now I just spoke to Carrie, and they've just finished copying them, and now they're going to start the long process of creating the metadata so that when you're looking up these magazines with keywords, that they'll come up. And they've got this thing called DC Dig, or Dig DC, I'm sorry. And that's sort of like their digital archives of DC stories, and that's where this is going to live. And then at some point, I'm going to decide, am I going to give the originals to American University, DC Public Library, Spelman College, or somebody else? I don't have to decide that today, but I did give them the magazines digitized, and she called me recently and said they're ready to be picked up. I can have them back because they are now going to the next level of digitizing them and getting them out there to the world.
Yay.
So yes, and how awesome is it to be doing that with a black lesbian?
Yes.
She uses the L word.
Yes, she
is. And so that is why I had to go with them.
Yes.
Now, American University, the contact there was Dr. Nikki Lane, another black lesbian. She may call herself a black queer woman, I'm not sure, but it's another black lesbian in my opinion. So both of them had that connection. And so either way, it would have been a great place to land. Don't get me wrong. So I just thought that the public library just seemed like a more appropriate place. I want to make sure that everybody has access to this. So thank you, Carrie Cotton Williams.
Yes, thank you, Carrie.
Thank you, Nobla, for sending her to D.C. so that she can help me. And she is this special.
I don't know if we can take credit for sending her to D.C.
Well, whatever you did.
But if we could, we would, because she's phenomenal.
She is. And I spoke to the director of DC Public Library because, that's a government entity. And I happened to be sitting with him at a table at an event, and I mentioned to him, I said, oh, you don't know me. I'm Sheila Alexander-Reid, director of the Mayor's Office of LGBTQ Affairs, but I also had a magazine called Women in Life, and your special collections director, Carrie Cotton Williams, has reached out to me to digitize. She's like, oh, yes, you're Sheila Alexander-Reid. Carrie talks so highly about you, and we're excited about the collection. Thank you so much for giving to it. I mean, this man went on and on and on about the value. And so that told me two things. A, I did the right thing. And B, thank God for Carrie, because she was blowing it up to her boss.
Yes.
So they definitely earn the right to have the magazine there.
Well, she is certainly someone who works in her sphere of influence.
Yes, there you go. There it is. Stay in your sphere of influence.
She is doing that.
So there's that.
Yeah, just as you have done for all the years of the work that you've done with Women of the Life and the work you're doing in the mayor's office, it's incredible. And I always tell our guests, I give our guests at the end of the interview an opportunity to add something that maybe we missed, or if there's something you want to say to our listeners that you think will be important. I reserve that space because, we've talked about so much, and this is such a great conversation, but there may be something you think older Black lesbians should know or be thinking about today, particularly during this hostile climate that we're in.
Well, I will say two things. I did not do this by myself. I did it with a core group of very close friends and associates, and I'd like to name them: Charlene Hamilton, the late Phyllis Kroom, Lois Alexander, Deidre Ochengrin, Kay Shakira Washington, Khadijah Tribble. So those are the key people right there. Second of all, I would say to older lesbians, there was a line I wrote in that article that was published, and I said, white gay men's stories go on to be movies. Our stories are forgotten if we do not tell them. If we do not tell them and make sure they are recorded. So do not let your story be erased. It may not go on to be made into a movie, but tell somebody your story and make them record it, write it down, something, because your life matters. There is value in your life, and I would say don't let anybody put you back in a closet in order to survive, because each day a little piece of yourself is going to be eaten away if you're living in a closet, and you deserve better.
A final question. Does your mother know that she was the impetus for your advocacy?
That's a great question. I think I told her one time. I said, Mom, I was speaking at a group, and they asked me how I got started, and I told them that it was because you were fighting with Daddy, and we had to protect you. And I now feel like that is why I'm an advocate for women. And she said, why did you tell them that? I said, because it's true. She's like, well, your father was a good man. I said, yes, he was. But guess what? This is the reality. And we are not going to rewrite history for the sake of anybody. This is the reality. This is what has made me what I am now. You survived all that. They ended up, ending in a great place together. He apologized for the behavior, changed his behavior, apologized to me, so that went on to have a happy ending. But let's not try to rewrite history and forget that existed.
Right.
That does not make him any less of a man. I said it does nobody any good who has ever suffered from domestic violence or who's ever had to view and or receive trauma. I said something good came out of that, and let's just not forget that it occurred and that something good came out of it. I said, so it's no shade to you or my father. It is what it is, and I think that that's my history, and I feel like I have a right to speak my own story.
Sheila Alexander-Reid, we all are much stronger for your telling your story today. Thank you for being part of our Black Lesbian Herstory. I love that conversation with Sheila. We had so much fun, as you can tell. There's so much to talk about. So many takeaways. I mean, we could just start with the idea of not coloring your history or herstory in order to make people look good at the end, but being honest about the stories that you carry. And also knowing your own sphere of influence and working in that so as not to make yourself weary with the multitude of things you could do, but sticking with the one thing you must do. Thank you, Sheila. We're all better for that conversation. If you like the podcast and are excited about what we do, or you want to give some feedback or comments, feel free to email me, Angela, at podcast@zaminobla.org. If you have a story idea, or if, like Sheila said, you want to tell your story and you want to share it in our podsphere, hit me up. Let me know. I'll be more than glad to talk with you. As always, it's been such a pleasure doing this episode, and there's so many great ones to come. So keep your ears to the ground. Stay right where you are, and we'll be back with another episode of the Zami Nobla podcast. In the meantime, have a sweet one.